يسوع. هل معنى هذا ان بولس كان يؤمن ان يسوع ابن يوسف النجار؟ لم يتكلم نهائيا على الميلاد العذري للمسيح ابدا.
They believed that rather than being conceived by the Holy Spirit in the womb of a virgin, Jesus was born the eldest son as a result of the sexual union between his parents, Mary and Joseph. But for Epiphanius and for others like him, such beliefs were heretical, and any gospel containing such ideas had to be stopped. The problem with the rejection of the virgin birth was that it cast doubts on Jesus' divinity. If there was no miraculous conception, then what made Jesus different from any other man? Well, the Ebionites believed it was his baptism that transformed him. For them, it was this moment when he became the Son of God.
The Ebionites are accused of not believing in the virgin birth, of rejecting the idea of Jesus being born special. They supposedly distinguish between the man Jesus, who was just an ordinary man born and died in an ordinary way, and the divine Christ. So Jesus Christ for them is not one, but two entities. And the man Jesus is used as a vehicle of the divine Christ, who comes upon him at a certain point, at his baptism, and then uses him as the human vehicle for the ministry. So at his death, the divine Christ deserts him, leaves him, goes up to heaven, and the man Jesus is left to die. So if that's the case, then they would have thought of not technically of Jesus as being divine, but of Jesus as being inhabited by divinity in some sense.
What was the problem with that for the Orthodox leaders of the Church?
One of the problems that causes for Orthodox Christians is that how you understand Jesus is closely connected with how you understand salvation and how you understand how salvation was worked out. The emergent Orthodox view is that in order for Jesus to win salvation for humans, he had to be authentically human, but he also had to be genuinely divine, both. And that had to include a real bodily death. Well, in this Ebionite view, as it is ascribed to them, the divine Christ simply, kind of parachutes down at a certain point and then opts out at a certain point. And the notion is you have a real separation, therefore, between the divine and the human, which prevents the two from having a real power and efficacy for salvation.
شفت يا أخوة، يعني الأفكار يعني سبحان الله نتيجة الموضوع لاهوت ونسيط من نبوت ومش عارف إيه، في حيرة عندهم. ولذلك الكنيسة مثلا الموضوع طبيعة المسيح، عندك الكنيسة الكاثوليكية البروتستانتية تقول إن يسوع له طبيعتين ومشيئتين. الكنيسة القبطية طبيعة واحدة ومشيئة واحدة. الكنيسة المورمية طبيعتين ومشيئة واحدة. مش عارفين، ما هم عارفين.
Complicated stuff.
سامعين كومبليكيتد، سبحان الله، سامعين أشياء معقدة، ده اللي أنا بقوله.
But the Ebionites were grappling with an extraordinary idea. God made man. And perhaps it's precisely the complexity of the concept that explains why Gospels like those of the Ebionites and the Docetists were still circulating during the 3rd and 4th centuries. What they were discussing, after all, was not a simple question. The nature of Christ.
يعني معنى الكلام ده يا اخوة، معنى الكلام ده ان في القرن الاول والثاني والثالث كان هناك جدال كبير جدا على موضوع لاهوت المسيح. هل هو انسان كامل؟ هل هو اله كامل؟ هل هو اله وليس انسان؟ هل هو فقط انسان؟ هل هو شخص ما بين الاله والانسان؟ او بالدليل والبرهان. كل الاناجيل دي بالدليل والبرهان. مؤتمر نقيا اللي قال له يسوع قال ان هو مثل الاب، اله من اله، نور من نور، اله حق من اله حق. 325 ميلادية. يسوع بقى اله من الامبراطور الوثني قسطنطين سنة 325 ميلادية. يسوع اصبح اله بامر، اترقى من انسان لاله بامر من الامبراطور الوثني سنة 325 ميلادية في مؤتمر نقيا. زي ما يكون واحد اترقى من عسكري بقى لواء او مشير. تخيلوا، ده امر منين؟ من الامبراطور قسطنطين الوثني 1394 ميلادي.
And the philosophical contradictions that provoked were not ones that were going to be easily resolved. But the gospel of the Ebionites did achieve something. Along with the Docetic texts, the gospel was one of the works which helped the early church to begin to define what was and what was not acceptable in the debate about Jesus' true nature.
مصيبة والله العظيم كارثة، والله مصيبة. من القرن الأول للقرن الرابع مش عارفين يحددوا طبيعة يسوع. 400 سنة.
Without such works to react to, it might well have taken the church longer to clarify exactly what it meant when it claimed that Christ was both human and divine. The church's final doctrine stated that Jesus was God from God, but also truly human. It was a statement which immediately condemned the gospel of Peter and the gospel of the Ebionites to the dustbin of heresy. But there was one issue on which both heretics and orthodox were united. They all accepted that the books of the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, was sacred. Well, almost united. There was one exception. His name was Marcion, and he was probably the greatest heretic the early church had to face. Had his opinions prevailed, the Old Testament would have ceased to exist altogether, and all traces of Jesus' Jewishness would have been obliterated from history. Marcion's ideas were so brilliant and so ruthlessly logical that he, more than any other man, began a movement which ultimately led to the loss of over 20 Gospels from history. His influence was such that he forced the early Christians to decide which books they wanted to revere and which they had to condemn. In 139 AD, a wealthy young man traveled from his birthplace on the coast of Turkey to the capital of the Roman Empire. On his arrival, he generously donated 200,000 sesterces to the fledgling Christian church, and then he set to work writing. 5 years later, he unveiled two of the most compelling, distinctive, and revolutionary literary productions the church had ever encountered, and they were so dangerous that they were to change the course of Christian history. But like the Gospel of the Ebionites, all physical traces of these controversial books have disappeared. The only evidence we have for their existence is once again in the writings of those who oppose them. A measure of Marcion's significance is that whilst the Ebionites are mentioned only 8 times in 3 books, Marcion's writings are the subject of great tomes. His ideas were so radical that one early church father, Tertullian, devoted 5 volumes to attacking Marcion and his ideas. So what was it about his beliefs that caused such consternation? Well, unlike the Ebionites, rather than embracing the Jewishness of Christianity, Marcion utterly rejected it. And it was the radical form that this rejection took which caused such a storm. Marcion began a careful comparison of the Old Testament with the scriptures about Jesus, and what he discovered led him to a shocking conclusion. He came to believe that the gospel brought by Jesus was the good news of deliverance, involving love, forgiveness, and redemption. And by way of contrast, that the Jewish law was the bad news which had made the gospel necessary in the first place. And he saw that this Jewish law involved strict commandments, judgment, and death.